Good morning. In less than 3 months, the Winter Olympics will begin in Beijing. According to media reports, the Biden administration is prepared to announce a diplomatic boycott. This is the least, the absolute bare minimum that any civilized nation would do for these Genocide Olympics. I'm here today to call on the Biden administration to mount a complete and total boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics. No athletes, no administration officials, no corporate sponsors. I call for this boycott on two separate grounds. First, to protect the safety and the security of our athletes. 5 months ago, I wrote to the Biden administration to ask them what their plan was to protect our athletes in communist China. They delayed their answer. They recently sent me an answer, only through restricted channels, even though there was nothing classified in their answer. And the sum total of the response to my letter was they have no plan. They have no plan to protect our athletes and their coaches and their staff from the very real and very concrete dangers that I outlined last June. First, ubiquitous surveillance. The surveillance of our athletes in their dorm rooms, in their bathrooms, in their practice facilities, their cell phones, other electronic devices. Second, DNA harvesting. The Chinese Communist Party wants to corner the market and lead the world on genetic data testing and harvesting to advance their life science technology research in many fields. They may even use COVID-19 tests as a way to harvest DNA from our world-class athletes. Third, from simple hostage-taking, we've seen with the recent case of the Huawei settlement that the Chinese Communist Party is more than willing to take hostages of Westerners to advance their own diplomatic or economic goals. Again, the Biden administration has laid out no plan how to protect our athletes from the Chinese communists. And second, we should boycott these games because of China's crimes against the United States and the civilized world and its own people. China runs a totalitarian slave state in which they keep hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of religious and ethnic minorities in gulags, subjecting them to slave labor, subjecting ethnic women to mass rape and sterilization as a form of ethnic cleansing. They harvest organs from dissidents and ethnic and religious minorities. They've also cracked down on Hong Kong, denying Hong Kongers their autonomy that was guaranteed under China's international obligations, to say nothing of the fact that China unleashed a plague on the world that has killed millions of people and has disrupted the lives of every American. For these reasons, the safety and security of our own athletes and China's crimes against the world, we should launch a complete and total boycott of China's Genocide Olympics. I regret that this will prevent about 300 of America's world-class athletes from competing in the Olympics. I sympathize with them. However, they have been failed by this administration, who months ago, could have worked with our allies to develop a plan to conduct these games in another country. They've been failed by the leaders of the International Olympic Movement, who should have never awarded these games to a communist tyranny. So today, I call on the Biden administration to boycott the Chinese Winter Olympics. I'll now take your questions.
You mentioned it briefly, but what is your message, though, to all those athletes who have worked hard for so long to go to these Winter Games? And also, it didn't seem like from 1980, the only people who were penalized at the end of the day were the athletes. So how do you rectify it? What do you tell them?
Well, again, I sympathize with the approximately 300 athletes who are going to compete in these games for the United States, should we compete. I regret that it's come to this. But the responsibility for a boycott rests on the failures of the Biden administration. Many senators, for many months, have been calling on the Biden administration to relocate these games. That was feasible. The Winter Olympics are far smaller than the Summer Olympics. There's probably half a dozen countries in the world today that could host the Winter Olympics on 6 months or 12 months' notice. The Biden administration didn't take those steps. They probably didn't take them because they wanted Xi Jinping's cooperation at the Glasgow Climate Change Conference. I don't think it's an accident. I don't think it's an accident that the administration only leaked its plans of a so-called diplomatic boycott after that climate change conference ended. And second, the blame rests with the International Olympic movement, who should not award games to communist tyrannies. So again, I regret that these athletes would not have the opportunity to compete in these Olympics. I hope that most of them would be able to compete in Italy in 2026. But the blame rests on the Biden administration for failing to lead, for failing to protect our own athletes while they're in China, and on the leaders of the International Olympic movement.
Two questions. First, I know you said a diplomatic boycott is the minimum, but are you supportive of Senator Young and others' amendments to include that language in the NDAA? And separately on the NDAA, can you give us any update on your efforts to try to amend the legislation requiring women to be drafted?
So first, I do support legislative efforts to impose a diplomatic, and I would add economic boycott. Corporate sponsors of these games should not be traveling to celebrate Chinese communists. However, that is probably going to be too little and too late. And now it's not enough either. The administration made clear in their response to my June letter that they obviously do not have a plan to protect our athletes from the threats that the Chinese Communist Party poses to them. Ubiquitous surveillance and DNA harvesting, or even hostage taking. So it's too little and too late at this point.
Hi, so I'm wondering, do you think that by not taking this action, if they decide not to do the diplomatic boycott, or they don't take even stronger action, do you think that's in some way indirectly supporting these human rights abuses?
Well, I can only assume the Biden administration is at least going to announce a diplomatic boycott. Again, I believe that they waited until after the Glasgow Climate Change Conference to announce it because they didn't want to offend Xi Jinping beforehand. But now, having floated that trial balloon, if they in fact don't announce that diplomatic boycott, if they allow the Secretary of State or the Vice President or someone else to lead a delegation to China, I think it would be an appalling lack of judgment and failure of moral leadership to support with a diplomatic presence the Chinese Communist Party, which is committing genocide against its own people. And that's not just a judgment I've made, that's a judgment that Joe Biden's State Department has made.
One more question for you. So you mentioned the organ harvesting, and this is a really crucial issue, particularly with Falun Gong practitioners in China. I know there's been some resolution here in Congress to help this issue, to condemn the issue. Why do you think that it hasn't moved forward, and what can the U.S. do to help this move forward?
Well, unfortunately, you have a lot of panda huggers in Congress who don't want to stand up to the Chinese Communist Party and who are carrying water for the Biden administration, who care more about things like getting Xi Jinping to make some fantastical promise about carbon emissions 30 years in the future, or to buy cheap solar panels that probably won't work, as most things from China don't work, as part of their big Green New Deal. So you've got a lot of panda huggers in Congress who are prioritizing these areas of what they perceive as needed cooperation with the Chinese communists, as opposed to standing up to a nation committing genocide against its own people.
Do you think that the administration could also take an action sooner to urge a new location? With a year's notice, it gets more difficult.
So the Trump administration took a much firmer stand on some of these issues, like announcing that it was a genocide against the religious and ethnic minorities in Xinjiang province, or imposing sanctions for those Chinese officials who cracked down in Hong Kong. I would have supported earlier action. It is feasible, though. It would have been feasible to move these Olympics as early as January, or even the summer. Again, these are the Winter Olympics we're talking about, not the Summer Olympics. The Winter Olympics are far smaller scale than are the Summer Olympics. And if the Biden administration had taken it seriously from the very beginning, if they had rallied support of our allies, I'm confident we could have found a free and democratic country that could have hosted these Winter Olympics on short notice.
So just for clarification, do you think that it would have been possible, or would you have supported some sort of U.S. athletes going to China under certain circumstances, or is there opposition?
So my first concern is always the safety and security of the American people, to include these world-class athletes and their coaches and their staff. That's why in June, when I inquired of the Biden administration what their plan was to protect our athletes, at the time I called for a diplomatic and economic boycott. I wasn't yet prepared to call for a complete and total boycott to include our athletes and their teams. I wanted the Biden administration to have a chance to outline their plans to protect them. But they've made clear now that they do not have a plan to protect them from things like DNA harvesting or ubiquitous surveillance or hostage taking. And we cannot put the lives and the safety of our athletes and their coaches and their support staff at risk in China.
So it sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, and clarify me if I'm wrong, is that you weren't thrilled with the idea of the Chinese Olympics in general, but that with certain provisions in place, you would have been okay with it.
Well, I've never been thrilled with the prospect of any Olympic Games being held in China. But the absolute responsibility of the United States government is to protect our citizens. And the Biden administration does not have a competent plan to protect our athletes and their coaches and their staff. The same gang that organized the withdrawal from Kabul is the gang that's in charge of the safety of these Olympians, and that's not a risk we should run.
I have just a follow-up on my previous question about limiting the draft.
Yes, I forgot about you.
On whether you all will get a vote on the amendment. You've also-
I hope we should have a vote on this. This is a serious change of military policy, and we should have a vote, and all senators should go on the record about whether they think we should be drafting America's daughters in the military against their will.
So you insist on that vote happening?
I think we should have an amendment. I believe that we are close to getting agreement on amendment to have a vote, but I think we should have that vote, and it should be an up or down vote. I don't want to keep people here through Thanksgiving. I don't want to keep people here longer than necessary. I just wish that we could have votes up or down on these important and consequential policy changes before they go into law.
Senator Cotton, so aside from the security issues and condemning the human rights abuses, do you think it also has an important signaling aspect by allowing for this diplomatic boycott? Because do you think American people are starting to actually wake up to this threat, and that this would also allow them to see more?
Well, the American people have been alive to the threat of China for a very long time. I mean, China has been stealing our jobs and taking our factories for decades. They've been putting our troops at risk and our allies and partners at risk for decades. The American people are right that China is responsible for unleashing this plague on the world. So the American people are well ahead of where the Biden administration is on this question. And like me, I'm sure all Americans believe that it would be very sad if our athletes can't compete in the Beijing Olympics. But they shouldn't have been awarded by the international Olympic movement in the first place, and the Biden administration should have had a better plan in advance to either protect our athletes in China or to move the games elsewhere. All right. If there are no other questions, thank you.